Did Bible authors believe in a literal Genesis?
Did the Bible authors believe in a literal Genesis? When we think about that question, we realize that there are many different kinds of literature in the Bible. There's poetry, there's parables, but much of the Bible is historical narrative. And so when we come to Genesis 1 to 11, we want to ask, what kind of literature is this? We could look at the internal evidence within Genesis 1 to 11 itself. We could look at what the church has believed about those chapters throughout history. But I want to consider, what did the biblical authors and Jesus himself believe about those chapters? In Numbers chapter 12, God tells us that he spoke to Moses face to face, not in dark sayings, but clearly. And so we should expect, as we read Genesis 1, that this is not mysterious writing. When we look at the Old Testament authors, we see that they consistently treat Genesis 1 to 11 as straightforward history. For example, the genealogies in 1 Chronicles 1 through 8 confirm the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11. When we look at the Psalms, we see in Psalm 33 that the psalmist emphasizes that God spoke and it was done. He created and it stood fast. We also see in Psalm 136 a recounting of the history of Israel in poetic form. Every other line is a poetic refrain, and the alternate lines are giving history, and some of those statements are referring to creation. In Isaiah 54 and in Ezekiel 14, the prophets refer to Noah, along with Daniel and Job, clearly taking all of those men as historical people. Then when we come to the New Testament, we look at the writings of the Apostle Paul. And in Romans chapter 5, he built his doctrine of death and salvation on the fact that through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. And Jesus came to solve that problem of death and sin. 1 Corinthians 15 says the same thing. We also see some other places where Paul refers to those early chapters. For example, in 1 Corinthians 11, he affirms that Adam was created first and then Eve, and that Eve was made from Adam. And then we have a very important passage in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, where Paul talks about the whole creation bearing witness to God. And he says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen through what has been made. That phrase, ever since the creation of the world, means that ever since God created, there have been human beings around to observe the witness of creation to the Creator. When we turn to Peter, 3 times in his 2 short letters, he refers to Noah and the flood. In chapter 3 of 1 Peter, he mentions the fact that there were 8 people saved in the ark. In chapter 2 of 2 Peter, he talks about Noah and Lot, and that they were righteous men in a wicked world that experienced judgment. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter is talking about the second coming of Christ, and he says that scoffers will reject the second coming of Christ because they reject the creation and the flood of Noah. And so Peter builds his teaching about the second coming on those 2 foundational truths. Then consider Jesus Christ himself. 11 times in the Gospels he is recorded as saying, "Have you not read?" And 30 times he said, "It is written." And then he just quoted the Scriptures. So his normal manner was to just take the Scriptures in a straightforward way. In Matthew 19, when he was answering a question about divorce, he went back to Genesis 1 and 2 and talked about Adam and Eve as the first marriage. In Luke 11, he affirms that Abel was the first prophet and that he was martyred. And a most important passage is in Mark 10, verse 6, where Jesus is answering a question about divorce from the Pharisees. And he says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So in Jesus' mind, Adam and Eve were right back there at the beginning of creation. They weren't 14 billion years after the beginning, as the evolutionists would want us to believe. So when we consider how to understand Genesis 1, we need to look at how the biblical authors treated those chapters. The Old Testament authors, the New Testament writers, and Jesus himself took it as straightforward literal history. And if we are faithful followers of Jesus, we must believe Him and His Word.